Chapter 18. The Pricking of My Thumbs. Not even 5 minutes later, a good ways down the road, Joanna should have been arriving by. Philip began to regret splitting up from her. There were plenty of people traveling down the path, none of them Joanna. Now all he could think about was whether Eris and the others had caught up to her. Philip sighed. With this many people coming to Altor, she might have gotten slowed down. Philip rubbed his face and tried to figure out what to do. He didn't regret not talking more honestly with his father. It was unthinkable that the kings weren't more worried. Even if they believed that the curse had been avoided, did they truly think Maleficent would lie down and die if the curse failed? "Let's go to Briar Rose and convince her and her aunts to get out of it there," he told Samson. "Joanna should have gotten to the castle by then. Not that father will listen to her either." Samson snorted. "Fine, yes. I may also just want to see her again," said Philip, flicking Samson's neck. He was grateful that horses didn't know what blushing meant. Talking to her in real life is more fun than overhearing her life in dreams. She's smart. She already knows what's happening. Maybe she'll have an idea about what to do. Also, he should probably update her about how he had threatened his father with marrying her. He wondered if, like him, she wouldn't find it the worst idea in the world, but he figured that was a conversation they could save for after they figured out how to handle Maleficent. "Worst part of this all is that Joanna was right," said Philip. "Maleficent's not just threatening Princess Aurora and Altor. Everyone is in danger. We have the sword and shield, which is something, so we need to make a plan." If only he could talk to Princess Aurora. She was the missing piece in all of this. He should have stayed back at the castle and warned her when she arrived, but he had let his emotions get the better of him. Philip urged Samson toward the woods. The sun fell quickly, and long shadows stretched across the trees. Nestled in the valley of the forest was a thatched-roofed cottage with a creaking water wheel. The roots of a large old tree made up the front of the building. Philip whistled as he neared so as not to frighten Briar Rose or her aunts. Small footprints led from the well-trodden forest path over a small bridge. Philip dismounted near the door. How had no one ever stumbled upon the cottage? The more he learned about Briar Rose's circumstances, the stranger they seemed. It was all the more reason to help her escape. He adjusted his hat and shared a knowing look with Samson, who gave him an encouraging nod. Philip jokingly grasped his hands together for luck and then knocked on the door. No lights flickered inside. "Come in," a woman called out. He opened the door into darkness. Something heavy slammed into his head, and a gag was stuffed into his mouth. More things grabbed his legs and snatched up his arms. Rope was thrown around his shoulders, and Philip struck out, sending something flying. Chatter filled his ears, and he struggled against the hold whoever these people had on him. It wasn't magic, so it couldn't be Poenna and Frike. He spat out the gag. Reaching back, he flung whoever it was off his back with his one free arm. It was one of Maleficent's goons. While growing up, Philip had often seen paintings and heard descriptions of the small creatures in makeshift armor. Their horns and claws and fangs now nipped at Philip's skin as sharply as their small swords, and another gagged him again. More ropes were knotted around his arms and chest. Two of the creatures clung to his legs like shackles. A raven's caw flooded his veins with ice. Philip fought against the restraints, but it was no use. From the shadows stalked a familiar figure, Maleficent. The stories did little justice to her. Her hair was bundled up beneath a black headdress shaped like two horns, the sharp peak of it highlighted by her arched black brows. Large round eyes of glittering black stared unblinkingly at him in the dark, and her heart-shaped lips were painted a vivid red. Her enchanted creatures yanked him upright like a puppet, and she smiled, lifting an unlit candle. As she neared him, it flared. The flame burned unnaturally cold. Well, she grinned, and leaning close to his face to study him. This is a pleasant surprise. Her skin was a pale, pale green that glowed in the dim light and stood out starkly against her black and purple robes. Her creatures tittered about her feet. Relief cut through Philip's terror as he frantically looked around the cottage. At least Briar Rose wasn't there, and it didn't look as if there had been a struggle before he arrived. Briar Rose and her aunts must have left before the trap was set. They had to be gone. But where was Briar Rose? Could she have been an illusion in Maleficent's magic? A trick to lead him there? Philip pushed the thought away. Briar Rose couldn't be a ruse. She was real. She had to be. She was real, and she had escaped. I set my trap for a peasant, and lo, she said, striking her staff against the floor, I catch a prince. Philip wasn't sure what she meant by intending to catch a peasant, but he did not plan on being around long enough to find out. Maleficent laughed, and like a lightning strike, her mood shifted. Away with him, said Maleficent, gesturing to her minions. But gently, my pets, gently. They prodded and dragged Philip toward the door, and he kicked his fallen hat out of the way, hoping that if anyone showed up later, Briar Rose, Joanna, Eris, they would figure out what had happened, or at least know that he had been there. He struggled against the bonds, but it was no use. The raven landed on Philip's head and tugged its talons into his scalp. Maleficent followed them. I have plans for our royal guest, she said. Outside, more of Maleficent's enchanted creatures had taken control of Samson's reins, and Philip tried to slip free of his restraints once more. One of the goons hit him hard in the back of the head. Gently, Maleficent repeated. I had thought my dear princess had found some boy, common as dirt, to woo her. But your face I remember. Curious. True love often draws its victims together. But I assume my curse would prevent a chance meeting. My dear princess? True love? Before Philip could think on that, a flickering dot appeared above Samson's head. It grew as it neared them. Suddenly, Eris alighted on the bridge. Fury and grief writhed in Philip's gut. He braced himself. He could not let Eris see him cry. Mistress, Eris said, not even glancing at Philip. She dropped to her knees in the mud before Maleficent. I see you found your gifts. Maleficent arched one brow. Well, my dear, that depends. I see only one gift here, and I am the one who acquired him. That is not to mention that I very clearly recall banishing you from my sight for eternity for your failures in the First War. Yes, and I dare not disobey and come to you without something to make up for my failures. Prince Philip has been with us these last 2 weeks, the silly boy, and your second gift is here. Eris rose and went to Samson, then pulled from his bag the pack hiding the Sword of Truth. She could not grasp it and let it fall to the forest floor. Poena and Frike have the third and final gift, the Shield of Virtue. They are on their way now. Philip inhaled, a new worry overtaking him. They must have gotten Joanna, but she had to be all right. She had to be. Are these gifts or bribes, my erstwhile student? Maleficent waved away Eris's answer. It matters not. You convinced him to deliver them to me. How deliciously cruel and fortuitous. We would never demand forgiveness or attempt to elicit with bribes, and we will leave again if you desire it. You need only say the word, said Eris, and finally she looked at him. As Maleficent investigated the Sword of Truth, Eris shook her head at Philip and let her expression fall. There wasn't regret in her eyes, only disappointment. You taught me well, mistress, and I know you never give second chances when failed or betrayed. She swallowed her final word as if it pained her, and Philip shook with anger. So she thought he had betrayed her. Had she really expected him to flee and save himself, leaving everyone else to die? That was worse, however, making him feel small and foolish. She had taken the things he wanted the most, a mentor, a future, the trust of an adult, and twisted them into a mockery. Eris turned away and bowed to Maleficent. "Oh, Eris, you do surprise me," Maleficent said, and took Eris's chin between her thumb and forefinger. She tilted back Eris's head. "A touch overcomplicated, I think, but subtlety has never been your strength, and why should it be? Chaos suits you. He is yours, and he is heartbroken." Eris stared up at Maleficent, blinking fast as if Maleficent were the sun herself. "You always taught me that hopelessness tastes better when the hope was real." "So I did." Maleficent rolled her eyes to Philip and then turned her head. Her hand slid from Eris's chin. "But did you think this would return you to my good graces?" Eris drew in a shuddering breath. "I did it for you with no hope of my own, as did the others. I do love how easily you lie," said Maleficent. "Are they truly on their way, my pet?" Maleficent cast her raven into the sky and sank into the shadows to await the other fairies, leaving Eris and Philip alone. Eris approached Philip, her blue eyes skimming his injuries. Softly she said, "How rude of you to take my offer and spit it in my face." Philip rubbed his cheek against his shoulder and worked his gag away. "I couldn't let everyone die. You said you believed in me," he hissed. "I believed you were smarter than this, but I was clearly wrong," she said. "I tried. Whatever happens now is on you." "Why?" Philip asked. "Why do you need to help her?" "I told you. I love my teacher." She glanced over his shoulder at the shadows where Maleficent lurked. Eris drew herself up. "We failed during the last war, and I will not make that mistake again." Philip tried to ram his head into hers, and one of the creatures snatched him back. Finally she met his gaze. Disappointment etched into every wrinkle of her shocked expression. "I should have known you would let me down." She shook her head, laughed to herself, and refastened his gag. "It's the only thing you're good at." Philip stewed, his feelings alternating between fury and grief every few minutes. Then a loud call interrupted his thoughts as Maleficent's raven returned from the woods. Shortly after, a light appeared. It was Poenna, with fire in one hand and a bound and gagged Joanna in the other. She dragged Joanna by the arm. On Joanna's back was the cloth-wrapped shield of virtue. She closed her eyes when she saw that Philip was captured as well. Frank flew through the gloaming behind them. Maleficent glided forward. "Mistress," Frank called out, landing and sweeping into a low bow. Poenna curtsied, extinguishing the flame but keeping hold of Joanna. "Mistress, I would not have believed the three of you capable of working together, and yet here you all stand, successful and still alive," said Maleficent. "Perhaps you have learned from past mistakes." "Anything for you," said Frank. She glared at Joanna. "Drop it here." Joanna narrowed her eyes and leaned back, letting the shield slip from her back. It hit the ground with an echoing thunk, and Maleficent's raven landed on its edge. The raven cawed and hopped off, smoke curling up from its feet. Maleficent tapped her fingers against her staff. Yes, yes," she muttered. "This will do." She twirled her wrists, and magic gathered around the sword and shield as a stormy cloud. Power crackled in the air. Philip's hair stood on end. "Go," said Maleficent, and the sword and shield vanished. The cloud of magic slowly dissipated. Philip slumped. "I must deal with the sword and shield and ensure that no one else will be able to track or retrieve them," Maleficent said. She waved her creatures off, and they scurried in the woods down some path Philip couldn't see. "Bring him to me, alive. Once you are finished, but do with her what you please." Slowly, Maleficent walked away from the cottage. The candle in her hand went out, darkness pressing in on her from all sides, and she faded into the night like a shadow. One final call from her raven marked her departure. "Perfect!" Eris clapped her hands and rounded on Philip. "Let's have some fun, shall we?" A vine whipped out from the forest and curled around his throat, then dragged him to stand next to Joanna and Samson. Samson's lead was tied to the bridge, and Philip let his foot catch it. He tripped, landing hard on his face. Frike laughed. "He's finally groveling," said Poana, tossing her flame from hand to hand. "I prefer it." Philip crawled to his knees. Philip's lead pressed against his back, and Philip's fingers were too thick and ungainly to work quickly. Joanna shuffled until she was standing next to him, her legs blocking what he was doing, and he leaned against her. It was the only obvious move, and he could have cried knowing that she had recognized his faint. He couldn't think about what would happen to them soon, or what was going on at the castle with Princess Aurora. He could only focus on the here and now. If he didn't, he would fall to pieces. "Why do we have to give him to Maleficent?" asked Frike. "It's not fair. We did all the work." "Please," said Eris, rolling her eyes. "Tell the Mistress of Evil that and see what happens." Philip tore with his nails at the rope tying Samson to the bridge. If he could see Samson free, maybe that would be enough of a distraction for them to escape. "There is so much we could do," Poana said, a flame twining between her fingers. "He did waste precious weeks of our lives." "In fairness, that was our plan," said Eris. Poana huffed. "When have we ever been fair?" Frike made a cutting motion with her fingers, and a shadow tore up from the ground. It grabbed Joanna by the collar and dragged her toward them. "You're in for a treat," Frike said. "I've had plenty of time to think up the most poetic suffering for you." Philip finally managed to undo the rope. He flicked Samson's ankle and the horse took off, sprinting through the four of them. Poana and Eris darted off to one side, and Frike yanked Joanna the other way. Frike shrieked and dropped her. "She bit me!" yelled Frike, holding up her bleeding hand. "The little gnat bit me!" And I'd do it again," shouted Joanna. "Philip, run!" he screamed. "Go!" Joanna nodded, her face set, and grabbed Samson's saddle with her bound hands. She threw a leg up and took off in one fluid motion. Magic flared in the valley, but there were far too many trees for Poana's fire or Eris's vines to have a clear angle by which to grab Joanna or Samson. Frike wrapped her shaking hand in the skirt of her orange gown, while Poana turned her magic on the cottage, setting it up in flames. Eris marched over to Philip. "Go get her by any means," said Eris to the others. "Take her to the mountain if you must. I will take our prince there." The other two vanished in the blink of an eye, and Eris pulled Philip by his ear to his feet. "You ungrateful little bug," she pinched harder. "I risked everything for you, and you threw it back at me as if it meant nothing. Nothing!" Her magic and ice-cold wind tore through his thin hose and tunic, chilling him to the bone. She snapped the fingers of her other hand, and there was a shift as if the whole world save for Philip had twisted on its axis. Magic gripped his spine and yanked as he doubled over with a gasp. Eris let him crumble to the ground. Floor. There was a stone floor. Philip choked on his gag and forced himself to look around. "Welcome," said Eris, brushing the dirt from her gown. "I'm sure you'll appreciate my mistress's hospitality." They were in an entry hall of dark stone. The floor was hot, nearly scalding his bare hands. The castle was old and ruined, and the natural world had started breaking through the cracks of the stones. Moss and roots curled around splintered walls, and Eris led Philip to the other end of the hall, where a broken staircase led up to an alcove meant for a throne. The listing shattered columns rocked as they walked past them. The wind tore through holes in the wall and ceiling. Philip stared up at the pale green sky, the same shade as Maleficent's skin, and swallowed. "Oh," Eris said with a breathy sigh. "Isn't Maleficent exquisite? I couldn't even move them 2 inches, but she got them all the way here." The sword of truth and the shield of virtue sat at the foot of the throne. 2 of her enchanted creatures stood guard over them, and one stood scratching its back with a knife to glare at Philip. Eris shooed the 2 away, shoved Philip toward the arms, and loosened the ropes around him enough for him to pick up the blanket-wrapped bundles. He shifted and tried to find the sword's hilt. "It's no use," she said. "I'm not allowed to kill you, but my mistress said nothing about maiming you." A cold breeze curled around his wrists, and Philip shook his head. He gestured toward his mouth. "Oh no," she said. "You had your chance, and I don't care to hear what noble nonsense you'll spout in your defense to think I—" She cut herself off, raised a hand, and shook her head. "No, you're not worth it." She motioned for him to walk ahead of her, the stairs on the left. It was a spiraling staircase that led up so high clouds blocked the arrow slits and crept through the cracks between the stones. Philip's legs ached with the stress of climbing, but the sword and shield weighed nothing despite the awkward way he had been forced to carry them. He knew he was in the old fortress atop the Forbidden Mountain, though he had no idea of how to get home from there. A bitter panic clogged his throat. "Set them in here," said Eris, once they reached the top of the tower. The tower room was small and cramped, stuffed to the ceiling with magical staffs, crumbling tomes, and a display case overfilled with what looked like small fairy statues. Philip stumbled inside. A cold hand gripped the back of his neck. "Drop them," she squeezed. Eris squeezed, and he placed the shield on the ground. He let the sword fall in such a way that the cloth around it began to unravel. Good boy. It wasn't hopeless yet. Joanna was still out there. His father and King Stefan were still out there, and the gift of Princess Aurora's cursed sleep would save her from death. Philip had to figure out how to escape. Eris removed the gag covering his mouth. "I can hear you plotting and fuming," she said. His retort was lost in a blast of heated air that tasted like metal and oil. With a pop, Poena and Frike returned. Poena landed hard atop a display case of wands and drifted down on her wings. Frike appeared on her knees before Eris and Philip. Eris's fingers tightened. "Joanna?" she asked. Frike shook her head. "She's hiding somewhere within King Stefan's castle. Couldn't find her among the others." "Are you angry?" Poena asked, gliding to them. "She is hardly anything worth worrying over. We acquired the sword and shield. Everything is going according to plan, and I am tired of following your orders." "How? You never execute them correctly," said Eris, cracking the bones of each finger one by one. "I'm not angry. I'm counting to 10 so that I don't strangle you, because I'm thrilled by your mediocrity and utter lack of care. Loose threads can fray. What do we not want?" "Fraying," mumbled Frike and Poena in unison. "Fraying." Eris grabbed Philip by the tunic and shoved him toward the stairs. "Go do your jobs and find her while I show His Highness to his room." "There's no need to chase Joanna," Philip blurted out. His mind was spinning too fast for him to think, but he could stall for Joanna. Maybe he could keep all 3 of them there. Why bother chasing after her when you've got the prince right here? Poena started to elaborate, and Eris hissed at her. "Go," she said. "He's trying to distract you." The other 2 vanished in a flurry of dust and rustling pages. "Get moving," she said, shoving him back toward the stairs. "And please stop trying to pull one over on me. I wasn't born last century, you know." "Actually, I didn't," he said, walking slowly and committing to memory the details of the path they took. "I don't know anything about you." "Don't be ridiculous. You know I'm smarter than you. You know I'm beautiful, and you know my name." She laughed and prodded him between the shoulder blades. even if you can't spell it backwards." He held back a groan, remembering the thieves. "Sire, of course." "Yes, if this has taught me anything, it's that I should have been more paranoid," he muttered. "Do the others know you let me run?" "You really do want me to cut out your tongue," Eris directed him through a crooked wooden door down a narrow hallway. They traveled deeper into the mountain. "I thought you were more ambitious, but you did refuse our first offer of magic. I should have known." "My condolences to your ego," said Philip. "It must have been quite fragile." "Yes," she drawled. "Of the two of us, I'm the insecure one." The dungeons were deep in the bowels of the castle. Philip could barely keep track of the twists and turns in the falling structure, scuffing the corners with his boots whenever he could. The farther they went, the emptier he felt. Hopelessness was more potent after glimpsing a good end. "Well, have fun," said Eris, opening a thick door with a wave of her wand. "I would say it's been a pleasure, but it's mostly been tedious." The ropes holding Philip took on a life of their own and dragged him to the stone bench in the corner. Chains rose like snakes and snapped around his wrists. Another set of shackles clamped around his ankles. Philip collapsed onto the bench as the rope slithered back to Eris. They curled around her outstretched arm and went still. "Why befriend me?" he asked softly. "Did you think I would let Maleficent destroy my home to train with you? You didn't care for your father, betrothed, or kingdom, so I thought you might. I never had a student before, but I saw something in you that pulled at my heartstrings. You were so uncertain, so afraid." She tilted her head from side to side, curls rustling against her round shoulders. "There were so many options open to you, and you turned your nose up at all of them because you didn't like your responsibilities. I could have poured water in the dirt and told you lapping it up like a dog would give you a way to escape your father, and you would have done it and barked. But I didn't. I gave you a chance to embrace the life you wanted. I will not make that mistake again." Philip's stomach rolled and protested, and his eyes burned. He hadn't known. He had been right there the whole time, clay in her hands. He had been so desperate that he had landed the life of everyone he loved over to Maleficent. For what? The life he wanted? He was a prince whether he liked it or not. What life wasn't within his grasp? No life now. "Don't wallow. It's unbecoming," said Eris, her eyes rolling up. She brushed Philip's tear away with her hand and flicked the tip of his nose. "You're just some boy lucky enough to be born a prince in a wealthy kingdom, you know. There's nothing special about you." Philip swallowed, fighting to keep from crying more and feeding into her love of his suffering. "You haven't won yet. Aurora's not dead, and her true love is still out there." "Oh, Philip," Eris said, and clucked at him. "No matter. My mistress's plan for that is underway, but I'll forgive you for not being able to read the board. Enjoy your stay, your highness. While you wait, consider how you were always a player, and how you removed yourself from the game. None of this would have been possible if you had paid attention to your kingdom. You would have most certainly known about the Sword of Truth. Isn't that funny?" She laughed her way out of the door and locked it behind her. "A prince not having power," she said. "Poor little boy has to grow up to become a king and marry a beautiful girl. How tragic." Her voice echoed until the terrible cackling was all he could hear. And the worst of it all was that Philip knew she was right. He had dug this grave for his kingdom and himself.